Hello and welcome back to Biker Stuff. Today I'm going to talk about how forks work and the importance of the oil in them.
In every generation there is a chosen one. She alone will stand among the oily rags, the replacement parts and the used tyres. She is Biker Stuff.
Before I start, can I ask, if you haven't already, would you please subscribe, then ring my bell so that you will get notifications when I upload more to YouTube. Let me take the panels off the CBR, pull off the forks, strip one down, and I'll see you in a bit. I was originally going to show how to strip, fit new seals, refill with oil and replace the forks on my Honda CBR 400RR. As there are fork seal replacements all over YouTube, I didn't see the need to do another one, and provided you know what type your forks are, you can find a video guide to fix them. So I thought, let me fill in the gaps that are either missing or harder to find. Firstly, let's identify the different type of fork you may have. There are primarily three types of motorcycle telescopic fork. The most common forks on newer bikes are upside down and are mostly the same design. The upright forks come in two types. If there is no adjuster screw on the top cap, it is likely to be a damping rod fork, but if there is, it is probably a cartridge type. However, to confirm this, when you take the cap off, if it comes off with nothing attached, then it is a damping rod fork. Otherwise, it is the cartridge type. Now, I will move on to some tips about the removal, stripping and rebuilding of your fork. If you don't loosen the top cap before you remove the fork, you will struggle afterwards without damaging it. The trick here is to keep your lower clamp tight but loosen the top one, then you can undo the cap by a couple of turns. Next, loosen the lower clamp and slide the fork down and out. By loosening the top clamp, you take the tension off and the cap releases easily. If there are any rust spots on your stanchion, you need to clean them up now, especially if you are not replacing the seals, just the oil, as you can damage the seals as they pass over them. Take some fine wet or dry paper, something like 600 grit is good, and gently remove any high spots. A little oil on the paper will help. When you take the fork apart, keep everything in order and in the correct orientation. That way, when you put it all back together, there should be no confusion. Note the colour of the oil as it comes out. It will probably be a silver grey colour. This is from the metal scrapings from the inside of the fork and the sides of the spring as they bounced up and down for those thousands of miles. Don't worry, this is normal, but it does show you that you are in need of an oil change. When you refill with new fork oil, there are a few things to remember. The air gap is one of the most important parts of the rebuild, and I'll show you a couple of ways to get that right later. If you are just replacing your fork oil, then you need to measure the amount that comes out and replace it with the same amount of new oil, not what the book says, as that is for completely empty and dry forks. When you put the fork back on the bike, tighten the lower clamp but leave the top one loose. Now tighten your top cap according to the book before tightening the top clamp. Then finish the reassembly. Right, that is the forks rebuilt and reassembled. Now let me pass on some other tips and explanations about your front suspension. You may have noticed that the coils on your springs didn't have the same gaps all the way. Most road bikes have dual rate springs. These have maybe a quarter or less of the spring with closely wound coils and the rest with much wider gaps. The closely wound part of the spring is to take the impact of the small bumps in the road. Then, when they have fully closed, the wider gap coils take the load, which would be under heavy braking or speed bumps. You get the idea. Of course, not all bikes are the same. Some will have the same rate coil all the way up, which does make them easier to measure and also to replace for a different rate if you needed to. I wanted to be sure I told you how to put dual rate springs in the right way up. During my research for this video, I read my workshop manual which said that the tighter coils, the soft end, need to go towards the bottom. But then I saw a Dave Moss video and he said the opposite. You cannot deny that Dave knows suspension, but Honda built the bike, so I will choose Honda over Dave in this case. Okay, just to throw a spanner among the pigeons, the shock absorber is actually the spring, not the damper, despite what you might read. It's the same on the back. The shock is the coil spring, not the damper within. Fork oil. Not all fork oil is the same, not even if they have the same weight on the bottle. They measure all oils in centistrokes, although I'm not sure how they convert this into the viscous weight we see on the bottle. But if your bike manufacturer says to use Showa 5W fork oil, you might be surprised to know the centistroke measurement is almost the same as this Castrol 10W. So, if you want to match the feel of when the bike was new, get the correct brand and weight of oil. There are oil viscosity charts online if that interests you. I mentioned the air gap before. This should be in your workshop manual and is the gap allowed for the oil to move around. If you have a too big an air gap, then the oil can become aerated. The oil will feel too thin and your suspension can dive easier. However, if the gap is too small, you can get hydro-locking. This is when the oil has nowhere to go and will lock up in your forks before they have reached their full travel. There are a couple of ways to set the correct air gap. I have in the past used a ruler. Put a piece of tape on it to mark where the gap is and align that with the top of the fork and wait for the oil to reach the bottom of the ruler. But a tip I can share is to put the tape on 10mm higher. Then at the bottom of the ruler, put another piece of tape up to the 10mm line. That way, as you continue to fill, check, fill, and then as the oil is gradually approaching the correct gap, you get a 10mm warning. It won't just suddenly appear on the bottom of the ruler and you have to remove some oil to bring it back down to the correct gap. Another tip I've recently learned but not done yet is to use a syringe on a hose that is the length of the air gap. Then you overfill it and suck out the extra, which will bring it down to the correct level. I found this video which explains it better than I can.
Stand the fork on end, and the manual calls for, I think it was like 15.6 fluid ounces of SS8 fork oil from Honda, and this is a 16-ounce container, so we're going to dump the whole thing right in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and chug this in there. Sit there and run out for a minute. While that's doing that, I'll talk about my tool. This is the tool that I made up for measuring your air gap. This is a syringe that I picked up at CVS. It was like $3. Went to Lowe's, picked up some small clear tubing, and then this is a piece of brake line that I found that the clear tubing slides over. Used my calipers to measure from the bottom up, used some tape to mark it, put a zip tie on it, and it doesn't have to be like exact. You know, if they say you need to have 100 and I think this one's 116 millimeters of air gap, you know, it doesn't have to be exactly 116. It can be off a little bit. You just want both of your forks to be the same. Now we're going to go ahead and measure it. So now you're just going to take and stick that down inside your tube. Make sure it's straight up and down with your zip tie sitting there. And then go ahead and suck out fluid. You want to be careful that you don't pull the end of your syringe out. I did that last time. That's why there's fluid everywhere all over the place. And then just take your bottle, squirt that fluid back into there. You basically just want to suck until you get air, and that's when you've reached that level. So this fork here is good.
If you liked my video, don't forget to hit the like, press subscribe and ring my bell. Thank you for watching. I know you liked it, so tell your friends, and I'll see you here next time on Biker Stuff.